Spain once held the world in its hands. In the 16th century, it wasn't Britain flying the banner of the largest empire on earth. It was Spain. For the first time in history, one crown commanded a global empire stretching from Europe to Africa, from the Americas to Asia. They've ruled territories so vast that people began to say, "The sun never sets on the Spanish Empire," a phrase later borrowed by the British. But here is the paradox. The richest empire the world had ever seen collapsed under the weight of its own treasure. And the reason it matters today is simple, because just like Spain, we often mistake sudden inflows of money for real wealth. And the crash that follows is always brutal. When Spain stumbled into the New World after 1492, it struck what looked like an infinite jackpot. Gold and silver in quantities no European kingdom could imagine poured into Spanish hands. The conquest of Mexico in 1521 toppled the Aztec Empire, giving Spain access to rich mines, and a decade later, the conquest of Peru shattered the Inca Empire and unlocked the Mountain of Silver at Potosi, a mine so large it was called the Mountain that Eats Men. For more than a century, it fed a conveyor belt of treasure ships crossing the Atlantic. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported an estimated 180,000 tons of silver and 2,000 tons of gold. To put that into perspective, that's more silver than all of Europe had mined in the previous 1,000 years combined. This treasure didn't just reshape Europe. It reshaped the world. From Seville and Cadiz, Spanish ships carried bullion east to the Mediterranean, north to the Low Countries, and west across the Pacific to Manila, where silver was exchanged for Chinese silk and porcelain. It was the birth of the first truly global economy, and Spain sat at the center of it. For Americans today, here's the shock. When Jamestown, the first permanent English colony, was founded in 1607, little more than a swamp struggling to survive, Mexico City already had universities, printing presses, and cathedrals. Lima was a thriving city. St. Augustine in Florida, founded by Spain in 1565, was the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States. 4 decades before Jamestown, Spain wasn't just ahead. It was building global infrastructure while Britain and France were still fumbling with failed colonies. And yet, this empire fueled by rivers of bullion was hollow at its core, because Spain confused treasure with wealth. The silver was real, but what they did with it turned strength into weakness. Prices in Spain exploded. Between 1500 and 1600, inflation ran rampant, with prices quadrupling in a century. Ordinary Spaniards found bread and clothing harder to afford, even as their nation sat on mountains of silver. Why? Because money only holds value when it is scarce enough to be trusted. When too much bullion pours into an economy, its purchasing power collapses. Imagine a town where bread costs 1 coin. Suddenly, 10 times more coins arrive, but the number of bakers and loaves of bread stays the same. Bakers realize people have more coins, so they charge more. Soon bread costs 2, 3, 4 coins. Not because bread got better, but because the coins are worth less. That was Spain's fate. Economists call this the price revolution, the first great wave of global inflation, triggered by too much silver chasing too few goods. But the inflation didn't hit everyone equally. Elites, who handled silver first, nobles, merchants, and bankers, profited before prices adjusted. Ordinary people, living on fixed wages, were left behind. The irony was brutal. The more silver Spain brought in, the poorer its people felt. Silver that should have been a blessing instead became poison. The mistakes ran deeper. Instead of investing in productive industries, Spain spent its fortune on imports. Italian merchants, Dutch traders, and German craftsmen grew rich selling luxuries to Spain, paid for with American silver. The empire's own industries atrophied. Why build factories or trade networks when you could simply wait for the treasure fleet to arrive? Spain turned into a consumer, not a producer, even as its rivals reinvested every coin they could steal, capture, or earn. And of course, the Spanish monarchs burned staggering amounts of money on war. The Habsburg dynasty saw itself as the defender of Catholicism after the Reformation, and that mission carried an astronomical price tag. Treasure from Mexico and Peru funded wars against the Ottoman Turks, financed armies to suppress the Dutch revolt, and kept Spain entangled in the French wars of religion. The Crown poured money into the 30 Years' War, one of the bloodiest conflicts Europe ever saw, where Catholic and Protestant states clashed across the continent. Even the infamous Spanish Armada of 1588, a colossal fleet sent to crush Protestant England, was fueled by New World silver. And when that armada failed, the financial shock was devastating. So where did all the gold and silver go? Into battlefields, ships, and debt. Because Spain wasn't just spending what arrived. They were borrowing against treasure that hadn't yet landed. German banking families like the Fuggers, and later Genoese financiers, advanced enormous loans to the Crown, secured by future silver shipments. In theory, it was brilliant. The mines of Potosi would keep the silver flowing forever. In practice, it was suicidal. If a fleet was delayed, wrecked in a storm, or intercepted at sea, Spain defaulted. And default it did repeatedly. 4 times in the 16th century alone. 1557, 1575, 1596, and 1607. Imagine being the richest empire in the world and still declaring bankruptcy every 2 decades. That was Spain's reality, and into this fragile system sailed the pirates. They were not just random marauders, they were weapons of economic warfare. England and the Netherlands understood that if you struck the treasure fleets, you didn't just steal bullion, you collapsed Spain's credit. Francis Drake, backed by Queen Elizabeth, circled the globe in the 1580s, plundering Spanish galleons and returning home with treasure worth half of England's annual revenue. Pieteng, the Dutch privateer, captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet off Cuba in 1628, 11 million guilders worth of silver. That single strike nearly toppled Spain's finances again. Each time a fleet was lost, it wasn't just a bad day at sea. It was a sovereign default in real time. Spain had mortgaged tomorrow's treasure, and when pirates or storms claimed it, creditors across Europe were left unpaid. Meanwhile, England and the Netherlands reinvested their stolen silver in navies, banks, and trade companies, the foundations of their future empires.